If you've had any cryptid encounters that you'd like me to share on here, email me at jttosstories@gmail.com. Story 1. I'm not exactly sure what I saw, but here we go. I've only told my ex-wife and my current wife this. This happened to me in January of 2014 on a back road in northeast Arkansas. At the time, I was a newspaper delivery driver. I picked up my papers from the press usually at around 12:15, and then it was a 45-minute drive to get to the start of my route. At the time, I was a smoker, so after I bagged up enough newspapers to sustain my route for a while, I'd light up a cigarette and roll the window down. Being cold, I tried to keep it up as much as possible, because back then my car didn't have air conditioning. There's a really long stretch of gravel road called Old Military Road. On the left side of the road are mostly houses, and on the right side is fence posting and an open pasture with barns and troughs for horses and cows. It's in the middle of just about nowhere there, so there aren't any streetlights. Some people do have floodlights in their yards. So I'm driving along with my windows down, smoking a cigarette. It's 2:20 or 2:30 a.m., and I begin smelling a combination of burning hair and a real nasty infection below the belt. Not a mixture of the two, but one and also the other. It isn't a great smell. I toss the cigarette and roll my window up, but can still smell whatever this awful thing is. The further I go down the road, the worse it gets. Usually, I see some cows sleeping outside, or just some horses chilling, but nothing tonight. So I know that I'm not the only one that picked up on something being weird and left that night. As I'm coming up to a fork in the road, I have to take the left. There is a big open field to the far right, and I see what looks like a man with a deer's head. It was too dark for me to tell whether it was a man wearing a deer skull or an actual human deer cross, but it was definitely the source of whatever that smell was. It scared me out of my mind, and I didn't want to hang out long enough to figure out what exactly it was. To my perception, he was shoulder height, 7 feet tall. The head probably added a foot. I don't really know, but he was massive. They were definitely deer antlers, and the smell was disgusting. I saw him stretching his arms. Imagine flexing your arms and chest by making a wide C with your arms. His movements, for the 2 to 3 seconds that I saw him, looked to be human. I found a new job by late January, and then started in February, and was not interested in ever being out in that area again. Other weird stuff happened in the year. I did that job, but that was definitely the weirdest. Creepy deer man. Let's not meet. Story 2. My family is Russian. Both my parents are from Siberia, which is in northern Russia, and both were born in a city called Omsk. Anyways, a couple days ago, my dad and I got into a conversation that kept deviating from the original topic and eventually reached a point when we started talking about paranormal occurrences in our lives. I asked him why he believes in Yetis. A long time ago, he told me that he believes in Yetis, but didn't explain why. My dad is not the type of guy who believes in paranormal activity. He thinks ghosts and aliens are a bunch of nonsense, and it was to my surprise that he believed in Yeti, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, he sits up straight, clears his throat, and tells me the following. My dad is 51 years old, and in his 20s, he served in the military. He served in a place called Sputnik, a village close to the Russian border with Norway. If you look it up, you can still see the barracks and the whole military camp itself. It's pretty fascinating. All heavy-duty military supplies were always stored far away, even from the military camps itself, and kept as far away as possible from human activity, typically in a forest. One day, a group of 10 people, one of whom was my father, were tasked to go on an expedition to the warehouse to restock military supplies in the camp. This required many people because loading up the trucks with very heavy equipment and ammunition was a rather grueling task. My father got in the truck together with the others and they got on the road. They reached the place far later than anticipated because of something along the lines of, "We got a flat tire." The place they were going to is located near a city that's on the bank of one of the hundreds of rivers that you can see on the map, and the place was called Lavozero. They get there during the night. The only thing that was illuminating the forest were the stars. Since it was so dark and everyone was so tired, they decided to sleep over at the warehouse. They slept over at a dugout not too far away. Once they get there, everyone takes their spot on the floor and says goodnight. But no matter how tired my dad was, he couldn't fall asleep. He stayed up for another 30 minutes before standing up and seeing everyone with their eyes open. No one was asleep. He had thought that he was the only one who was awake, but he wasn't. The thing that was keeping him up was some sense of discomfort that he just couldn't explain, and he decided to share this with the others. Everyone nodded, and they said that they were all experiencing the exact same feeling. This didn't let him rest peacefully. Eventually, another 30 minutes go by, and the sense of discomfort had now evolved into a mild fear and panic. At this point, everyone is really concerned because they've got to wake up early tomorrow to move heavy boxes, and sleeping was essential. They kept laying in silence. All of a sudden, they hear a very strong thump on the roof of the building. The thumping persists, and it sounds as if someone extremely heavy is walking on the roof. The roof was wooden. It was a sod roof with grass covering it, and my dad could tell for a fact it was someone walking because of the creaking the boards made. Simultaneously, everyone, as they discovered the next day, started hyperventilating, and everyone's heart started beating extremely fast. The thumping that the creature made was so loud it resonated in my dad's ears, and he felt his insides shake. One of the guys even passed out. At a certain point, the creature descended from the roof and started walking around the dugout. And one of the guys that was proud enough to open his eyes and look around said that the creature was peeking inside, but since it was dark, he could only see the silhouette. Eventually, whatever it was that was causing all this had left, and everyone went back to sleep. The next day, one of my dad's buddies asked a passing local about the phenomenon, and he said it was completely in the ordinary, and he even called it by a specific name, which unfortunately my father does not remember. Also, consider the fact that all this happened during the time of the Soviet Union. As you may or may not know, the Soviet Union was a completely atheist state. No cults, no beliefs in spirit, no religion. And pretty much everyone who believed in that sort of stuff was frowned upon. My father and the 9 other soldiers were ideology-packed elite troops. And honestly, hearing this from him sounded crazy because I knew for a fact that it was real. Story 3. Excuse this long story, but I'm trying to give lots of details and specifics on my experience. Let me first clarify that this was 4 years ago, when I was 15 on a muzzleloader's mule hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've frequently been out in this area, spreading in Summit County, that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming since, well, before I can remember. This has included lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I'm skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all those things. I find that it's impossible for science to know all that there is in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state, and he was a regional specialist and was over wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's done everything from habitat management programs, controlling fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted and darting black bears. He has seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, ruminants, plants, and natural phenomena for a majority of his life, And he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, and level headed. He's agnostic and is not superstitious, and often used to, lovingly and respectfully, of course, tease a certain CO who thinks that Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and other beings exist. Other than this experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not, at least partially, if not completely, identify, and other than the natural, innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, intoxicated and belligerent hunter, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication, he's told me over and over he's never been terrified of an animal or an experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Utah mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzle loaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women that my grandfather had worked with over the years as a supervisor slash biologist slash CO, and these were the people that I grew up with. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck deer, injuring but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon upset and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountain, which was hard to reach from the trail that she had shot from. A place my grandfather was familiar with because it was just a complete pain to get to, with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape, and he was so familiar, it didn't really seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing what she assumed were coyotes, which made her even more so concerned that if the deer died, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early morning, expecting to be back within an hour or two, after searching and having our guns with us, in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in places, with lots and lots of deadfall of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand why the other hunter experienced such fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees, which we followed for maybe 20 minutes, and then it got hard to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew that it would be out for about another hour before going down. It would also be just as difficult getting out of here as it was getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had recently bedded down in, followed with spatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them now completely safe, as it was illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large mag-like flashlight from his pack, and I put in my headlamp to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. About 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards clearings for water or to graze in the safety of lower light. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooves, animals, or small bits of movement in the trees from squirrels or birds were common and expected. We did not expect the deafening, disturbing sound that we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl, but in a few seconds it was unidentifiable, frightening, and even human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but it got louder and more intense with a screech to it. So unlike any coyote or any animal that we had ever heard. Then was the almost chittering that came in between the shrieks, and the movement of the trees became more calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen, as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious and a little baffled as to what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge of tone, of help, or I'm just screaming to mess with you. We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other natural and distant sounds had gone and was silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horribly deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us back to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and the sound of thumps against dead trees. Looking around with our lights, in between deadfall, maybe 12 or 15 feet in front of us, was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down with long, slender arms around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white, with the knots being dark brown, and whatever it had was skin that was almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round, and the eyes seemed sunken, and I could not tell you eye color other than for a flash of reflection on the eye from my light. And that face just seemed so sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. It never felt like it looked right at me. More my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious, like he was before with the sound. For a mere couple of seconds, I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut tight, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck. And my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backwards towards me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving slowly and with purpose through the trees to the side, and then drop down behind us, I would assume according to the sound, but I hope it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I have never before and never since seemed so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, what was that? Over and over I asked, and he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder from a sling and put a cap on the nipple of the igniter, making the gun live, and he then carried it in front of his body and his arm. He pulled out another headlight to put on himself. We started walking again towards the trail as he listed off, like he was talking to himself, what it wasn't. Things like, well, it couldn't have been a deer or an elk or a moose. It had hard arms, it was hunched, it stood upright. Or a bear? A very sick bear? It couldn't have been a bear. Was it the light? We heard the sound, the screeching human howl, held distantly once more before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel, but fairly flat, no deadfall. We pretty much jogged to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on the music as loudly as possible to try and distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went to talk with the others by the fire when he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained some stuff to his friends, but I don't know all that was said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me and saying that it was probably just a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day in the daylight, scavenged quite harshly by what I assume was coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was, and before and since, I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that I've never even compared to that. The scientist in me, and in my grandfather, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us hope and speculate it was just a deformed, sick animal in scant light, but I still have no idea what it was, and I just hope I never experience it again. Anyone have any ideas? Sorry again for a long story, but it helps me remember details if I tell the whole thing in detail.